Good morning. So good to see all of you. Thank you for being here with us today, and welcome again to our guest. We are glad you're with us and looking forward to studying with you this morning. Aren't we just so blessed? It's a wonderful thing, I think, just to start our week off this way and to be able to pause in our life and just focus on our God. Focus on who He is, how wonderful He is, the gift He provided in salvation, and then for providing us with a wonderful, wonderful spiritual family with which to spend our life with and to engage with. We're so blessed, and I hope that you are counting those many blessings this morning as we worship together. During the month of December, we have been talking about objective truth, and we have been talking about the basis for making statements like the one you see on the screen. Sin is always sin. Sin is always sin because God tells us it is. According to Psalm 31 and verse 5, God is the God of truth. We know that there's no falsehood in Him. He is the ultimate reality. What He declares is the way that it is. Jesus, in the night before His crucifixion, prayed, "Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth." And we read back in the book of Proverbs, every word of God proves true. So the word of God is something that we can trust in. It is something we stake our eternity on. And this passage in Psalm 19 in verse 8 comes to mind. And I just want you to read the first part of the verse and just focus on it and just let it speak to your heart right now. The precepts of the Lord are right. Just let that for a moment sink into your heart and mind. The precepts of the Lord are right. The commandment is pure, enlightening the eyes. Did you know everything that I've just said? Be it from every word of God proves true. Be it your word is truth. Be it what is said here in Psalm 19, your instruction is right. Did you know everything that I've just said is being met with wholesale rejection by our society at large today. And even some within the church may be rejecting these things as well. You see, over the last 2 weeks, we have been defining relativism. We are being told that truth is not an objective thing. It is not outside you. We're being told that truth is within you and that it is as unique as your own knowledge and experience allow. You have your truth, I have my truth, and we have no right to judge each other's versions of the truth. And so over the last few weeks, we've been talking about how truth is not a river that meanders and changes over time. Truth is a rock. It's steady. It's steadfast. It's immovable. It's unchanging. It is secure. It is right. But you know, when we think about our culture today that maintains that truth is relative, the problem with that is that this line of reasoning is something that can't be followed consistently. And I want you to work with me through this for just a few moments. The entire philosophy of moral relativism is totally inconsistent in and of itself. If I were to come up to you today and say, all truth is relative, and I were to make that statement with certainty, that statement, I would just betray the very thing I'm trying to prove. Because it's totally inconsistent. If I say all truth is relative, in actual reality, then relativism is false because there's at least one objective truth. Namely, that truth is relative. And so the whole philosophy is inconsistent with itself. And by the way, the bottom line is nobody believes this anyway. You have a mortgage? Is the amount of your payment and the length of your payments that is specified in the documents that you signed, is that a fixed truth or is it relative? Think about it. If it's relative, it means one thing to you and one thing to me. I can just say, you know what? That term of 360 months, I just don't like it. I reject that. That's not truth to me. I'm going to make it 1 month. Or I'm going to make it 0 months. Who would do that? Who would believe that? When you write down instructions or provide directions, do you expect other individuals to understand it in the same way that you do? Here, I found on the internet this week instructions for how to use Fix-A-Flat. Okay, I guess the makers of Fix-A-Flat determined there are people out there that need instructions on how to use it. So they made up this handy-dandy guide to tell you step by step what you do. And they expect you to be able to read those directions, follow them, and carry through in the proper usage of that product. It's objective information. It's fixed truth. Did you know that gravity works every time you fall down? It doesn't matter if you don't believe it or not. It is fixed truth. It is the way that it is. And every time that you fly, you rely on fixed truth. It matters not only to you, it matters to the pilot in the front of the plane. And every time that you have an operation, or every time you go to the pharmacy, every time you are a defendant in a court case, fixed truth matters. These things, brothers and sisters, especially in the natural world, are unchanging. They are unyielding. And if you test these things, they work every single time. In fact, we will do whatever necessary to protect ourselves from the certain harm that will come if we violate those natural laws. I don't like falling down the stairs, so I use a stair railing to help me get down the stairs. So on and so forth. In fact, when you leave here today, many of you, when you are going to be driving, why are you going to wear your seatbelt? Why are you going to wear your seatbelt? Well, it's not only just because the government requires you to wear a seatbelt, it is because you know the laws of physics work every single time. Now, we understand these things clearly in the natural and scientific world. In fact, nobody argues that there is fixed truth in these domains. But what about in matters of morality? What about matters of spirituality? And this is where the world breaks and parts ways with us. And here's the thing, brothers and sisters, we don't get to make a distinction between what goes on in the natural world and what happens in the spiritual world. Just as there are consequences for breaking the fixed laws of the universe in nature, we also need to understand there are serious consequences for breaking God's established laws in morality and in spiritual things and in right living. And it's just the fact that most of the time, though, when it comes to the penalty for breaking the moral code, God's moral law, that those consequences don't happen as fast. They're not as immediate. I think about it. You can practice immorality for decades and still be alive. Plenty of people out there doing that. But and listen, if you walk out into Bigger Road here in just a minute and get hit by a trash truck speeding down the road, that law is going to happen every time, and the consequence is going to be immediate. You're going to be dead before you hit the ground. You see, in the case of natural laws, those things are obvious, they're visible, they're experiential, they're rational, they're obvious, there's no way to argue against it. It's the same in the spiritual realm, though. Thinking back to the spiritual or the physical realm, why will you not walk into your kitchen this afternoon and plant your hand on the burner eye of your stove? Because you know what's going to happen. Why are you going to protect your kids from getting anywhere near that stove? Well, we know the answer. Because fixed truth is easy to see. It's without mercy. It's impartial. It is something that brings mostly immediate consequences to its violators. But often because there is not so much immediacy in the spiritual, people lose their minds and tell themselves, well, I can do anything I want. I can live however I want. And really, this is nothing more than a lie. And the majority of the culture has embraced what we read in Romans chapter 1, verse 28 to 32. The majority of culture said, I understand there's fixed truth out in the scientific world or the natural world, but I deny it for the spiritual or the moral. And Romans 1, 28 to 32 details what happens to a culture that makes this distinction. Paul says that there were many who did not see fit to acknowledge God, and therefore he gave them over to a debased mind to be doing what ought not to be done. And he goes on to say they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossips. They're slanderers. They're haters of God. They're insolent. They're haughty. They're boastful. They're inventors of evil. They're disobedient to parents. They're foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. And notice verse 32, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Brothers and sisters, there is no more apt description of the United States culture in 2019 going into 2020 than this. This is the world we live in. This is what's going on. And so the question before us this morning is, how do we go forward? How do we respond to this? What's the answer for us? And really, how can we begin to make a difference? I think sometimes we look at the world and say, there is just no way. And we almost throw up our hands before we even begin. So our task before us this morning is to talk about how do we respond to the relativist culture. And we're going to do this in three ways. On the back page of your outline is a bulletin, or the back page of your bulletin is an outline. I'll get it right in a minute. There's an outline back there, page 4. And I encourage you to take that out and use that as we follow together this morning. There's some points there, some fill in the blanks, some passages. You'll kind of get a map of where we're going. And you might even see how long I have to preach. Nobody would read the bulletin in that way, right? Certainly not. All right. Let's talk about this. How do we respond to this culture? I think one of the first things that needs to be pointed out is that when we're dealing with the culture, it is so easy for us just to get worn down. It really is. Because of the complete and total onslaught that we're facing. One scholar that I read about last week talks about us living in a post-truth world. He maintains that we're living in a world where the truth no longer matters. And think about it. Does the truth really matter anymore in the culture at large? I mean, who can you really trust? If you look out there across the spectrum, you see almost everybody lies. That will tell you what you want to hear instead of what you need to hear. Not offending someone is the most highly regarded value. Covenants and promises and vows, almost anything can be gotten out of and nobody thinks anything other. We're even losing trust in the institutions that we hold near and dear to our hearts, like law enforcement and even in our churches. It's all around us. And in many cases, it's become inconvenient to tell the truth. It's considered offensive. If you speak the truth on matters regard to immorality and homosexuality, you may be homophobic. You may be regarded in some quarters as racist or narrow-minded or ignorant or even just plain old backward. And so what happens is people are telling us all of this, that you are this, you are that, because they want to be left alone and be in their own select category of lies and deceits and untruths they're telling themselves. And they will challenge you if you go against them. So there was an article in, I think it was the New Yorker a few weeks ago, detailing this statement made by a Russian chess champion who is also a leader of a pro-democracy Russian group, and this guy is also an outspoken critic of the president. And I'm not here to talk about politics today. It is interesting as you read this statement. It's really intended to talk about the oppression of all who are conservative and how we beat down the truth on everybody else. But I'm not so much interested in that as I am the validity of the statement, because it cuts on both sides of our political arguments. Not here to talk about politics today. But notice what he says. The point of modern propaganda is not only to misinform or push an agenda, it is to exhaust your critical thinking so as to annihilate the truth. I would maintain to you that that's what the world is doing with Christianity. They are trying to overwhelm us in such a way that it's impossible. Why even bother with critical thinking? Because we're defeated before we even begin. We're worn out, we're tired. You know, how many of you feel worn out and weary when it comes to this? And really, how many of us are really unclear as how to respond to the onslaught of immorality and rot that's permeating the culture? I mean, you think about speaking up. But yet you work for a corporation that has fully embraced the politically correct culture. And you think about, in some way on the job, somebody's doing something, somebody said something, and you're going to respond in a biblical way, but then you think about what's going to happen. HR is going to get called in. You're going to be subjected to sensitivity training. You're going to be name-called and ostracized by your coworkers and maybe even fired. People will literally destroy you. They will stalk you on social media. If you post anything online, they're going to write it down and they're going to go call your employer and say, look, this guy is a hate-filled bigot. That's the world we're living in. Not too long ago, somebody had posted a comment on the Dayton Daily News about a news story they had reported. I don't remember what the issue was now, but what I do remember is this person made a statement that I would, and you would agree with, although I don't know what religion this person was. They made a statement that was biblically based. And another person got on there and responded and said, I have stalked you and found where you work, and I will be reporting your comments to your employer so that they can fire you. That's right here in Dayton, Ohio, just a matter of weeks ago. That's the world we're living in. Sometimes when these things happen, we kind of bend back and say, oh, man, it'd just be better for me if I keep my mouth shut. Why even try? Why even do that? And look, even churches are caving in to what the demand of the culture is. And so we think that there's no use. And you go back to this passage in Romans chapter 1, verse 32. Those who practice unrighteousness not only do them, but give approval, Paul says, to those who practice them. Listen, we are not imagining things when we feel the increased pressure to conform. And it's not just one victim group, it's not just one victim that's out there, it's an entire victim group that's been victimized. They figured out how to get into the media. The media gives them a sympathetic ear. That becomes a platform for advocacy. The media keeps projecting their lies, and suddenly the culture buys in, and before you know it, you've got lawmakers legislating law to protect their sin. That's the progression. So no wonder it's intimidating for us to stand up for what is right. And at times it feels like our voice is gaining less and less traction. Our voice is sounding more and more faint. And it feels impossible to convince people of the great deception that they have succumbed to. We're outside of their echo chamber. We're not in their group. And so they'll tell us, well, you just don't understand. You haven't walked down the same path that I've walked down. Who are you to judge? You are a person of privilege. Nerea Willis, writing in the Elite Daily, identifies 5 such examples of privilege. White privilege, socioeconomic privilege, Christian privilege, gender privilege, and heterosexual privilege. And so if you are in any one of these so-quote privileged groups, then all conversation is shut down when you begin to criticize or object because you just don't understand. And yet all of those people that are inside that group with the media assistance continue to insulate themselves. They even specialize in management of information, controlling the message, because they try to eliminate certain views so they can live more effectively in the lies that they embrace. Let me give you an example of this. When it comes to homosexuality, and I'm not just picking on that one sin, there's a whole lot of other examples of this, but this is probably the easiest. This is the low-hanging fruit. If you may have before have known a person that has been tempted and fallen into the homosexual lifestyle. Did you know that in certain quarters of this country you can't even bring up that it is possible to change and exit that lifestyle and go back to something else? And any mention of that is off limits, and that there are whole segments of society. In fact, the California legislature has outlawed even talking about getting out of that lifestyle. That's where we are. Did you know there was a person this week, was on the news on Friday? I don't agree with this man's actions. Let me just state that clearly. A man burned an LGBT flag in Iowa. And again, I don't agree with his actions. He was probably drunk when he did it, if you read the whole news story. He burned out in front of a bar. Do you know he got 16 years of prison for that? 16 years? Do you know there was a person who was convicted of child rape and abusing both of his children? He got 3 years in the same state. Brothers and sisters, what is wrong with this country? What is wrong with this country? What is going on? It's exactly backwards. We're being told that we can't talk about matters regarding abortion. We can't talk about matters about homosexuality or transgenderism or climate change because we're meddling with people. And by the way, we're being told by people in the church you can't talk about these things. That's all politics. By the way, everything is politics these days. Have you watched ESPN lately? They've corrupted sports. Listen, what we're talking about here transcends politics. What we need to understand is each one of the things I've just mentioned are things that emphasize, they are godless ideologies. That's what they're rooted in. They are extended to emphasize the creation over the creator, and they need to be resisted because they are very much a part of spirituality, and we need to refuse to be intimidated. If you think it's bad now in 2019, imagine being a Christian in first century Rome. What does Peter tell the Christians? He says, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? We need to hear that. When we're speaking up, we need to remember we're on God's side. We've got His truth. We've got weapons at our disposal. Who are you to suffer harm? You're not going to suffer harm spiritually. Peter goes on to say, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to everyone who asks for the reason of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. We need to hear that. Listen, just think ahead. I don't know how many of you have read through the vision book, what we're trying to do this first quarter, and even into the second quarter. There's 10 statements that we make, and I think it's in the first quarter. 10 statements that a lot of people would consider to be insensitive today. And look, we're not trying to be insensitive just for the sake of being insensitive. We're repeating biblical truth. But you know, as we go through the rest of the first quarter into the second quarter, we're going to give you answers so that you can make a reasonable defense in these matters. And we always do it with gentleness and respect. And then he goes on here, having a conscience so that when you're slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. I always move with gentleness. I always move with respect. I always practice good behavior myself so that others don't have anything to charge me with. That's how you live. That's how you respond. Don't be worn down by the onslaught of everything going on in the world around us. That's the first point. Now, let's talk about the second point. Here's something else. Don't be surprised when you're hated. We've got to understand that going in. Thomas Gray in his writing has said, where ignorance is bliss, it is folly to be wise. In Revelation 22:15, John is recording the words of Jesus. He says, there's going to be a lot of people out there that love and practice lies. And that's the world we live in. More and more people out there are trapped in this deception. They love it. And so they look at biblical truth and they think it's something that's extreme. They think it's something that's narrow and intolerant and judgmental and exclusive. They look at it as something that is enslaving. Robert Heinlein has said, almost any sect, cult, or religion will legislate its creed into law if it acquires the political power to do so. What's he saying? We want to be free to do what we want to do. And you don't have any right to tell us that we're wrong. That's the world. That's what the world's telling us. This is nothing new. You could go back to 300 years before Christ. Here's Plato that says, no one who is more hated than the one who speaks the truth. And by the way, this is the way the world treated Jesus. I know we've all read this passage before, but look with me, if you will, at John 15:25. John 15:25. Here is Jesus, the night before his death. Notice what he says in regards to the world and how the world looked at him. He says, they have hated me without a cause. They have hated me without a cause. Now, this is a quotation from the Old Testament. And I want to share with you Psalm 69 verse 4 where this comes from. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies. What are these two passages telling us? Psalm 69:4, John 15:25. They are telling us that we need to understand that we're going to be hated just like Jesus was. Why? Well, here's a passage we looked at last week. Jesus says, for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. So what does that mean for us as we mirror Jesus in our attitude and actions? You know, I got to thinking about this. This is sometimes hard for me personally because critics come. In my preaching, I've always had people that were critical of me or my family or whatever, and I guess it just goes with the job. But I've often, and Becky and I've had these discussions in private, and I've often asked her the question, what did I ever do to them? Why? I don't understand. I don't get this. All right, now zone out of that into just being a Christian and living how you're living and what's going on with your life. You know, there are people out there just going to hate you because of who you stand for, who you believe in. And they're going to wish that you don't even exist. Many hate us and would wish us out of existence. That's reality. But it can't deter us from our mission. Look at the second part of verse 37. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. We've got to embrace the truth that Jesus brought. We've got to share it with others. This is our mission. This is reflecting Jesus. This is what it is all about, even though the world thinks it's foolishness. Here's Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 1:18. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. Look at what he writes in verse 23 and 24 of the same passage. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those of us who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. See the contrast? For some, Jesus is a stumbling block. For others, Jesus is foolishness. But for us who have opened our hearts to God, it is the power of God. It is the wisdom of God. What we need to understand, this is by John MacArthur, I really like to comment. The gospel always offends the confronted or contented sinner living in deception. So we really shouldn't be surprised. Just our living is going to offend other people. It goes with the territory. In fact, let me just throw this out. If you're not hated by the world, you're doing something wrong. If you're not hated by the world, you're doing something wrong. The world is not our friend anyway, brothers and sisters. It is high time that we quit trying to tippy-toe around the truth and de-emphasize sin and apologize for who we are. It's time we stop that. You know, John chapter 8 relates very real in this part of the lesson. Here's Jesus. I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. What is the truth that Jesus is communicating here? What is he telling us? He's telling us the real slave is the one who commits sin. Sin is bondage. That's the truth. That's what's right. That's what will never change. That will always be factual. The real bondage, the real person in bondage is the one who is enslaved to his or her sin. And the real truth is that Jesus provides freedom from that. He provides a way out of that. Look at verse 36. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Forgiveness of sin is freedom. That's the message Jesus brought. They didn't want to hear that, though. Look at verse 37. Look at the words down there at the bottom part of the verse. My words find no place in you. Doesn't that describe the world today? The words that we're speaking, the words that we're all about, they find no place in our world today. Listen, no one is more hated in society than the person who speaks truth. Why did they why did they kill Jesus? Because he spoke truth. Look at verse 40. I am speaking to you the truth that I heard from God, Jesus says. Look at verse 42 and 43. If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you say you don't understand what I say? It's because you cannot bear to hear my word. There are so many people out there that cannot bear to hear the truth. And so then Jesus says, where all this goes back to, the origin of every lie is Satan. Those who live in the domain of darkness embrace and repeat lies. And so the question is what is the only hope for a person that finds him or herself in this condition, that has been bombarded and succumbed to all these lies and deceptions that are filling the culture? The only answer is truth. The truth found in God's Word. And yes, it's going to be offensive. Yes, it's going to hurt some people. And again, let me throw out this disclaimer. I am not condoning our going out and being purposely offensive and trying to purposely stir up hatred. Doing such would violate the principles of Colossians 4, 5, and 6, where we are to conduct ourselves with wisdom toward those who are outside. So I am not condoning that. But I am emphasizing the fact it's time for us to stand up. Never forget, the very essence of our message is going to be offensive to those who love their sin. And so for that, we do not apologize for. Understand you're going to be hated. But then finally, use your weapon. Use your weapon. Chris, I want to thank you for reading out of 2 Corinthians chapter 10 a few moments ago. And we're going to go back there for the remainder of our lesson this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And I want to put verse 3 back on the screen. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war to the flesh. So we're not warring according to the flesh. This is a spiritual battle that we're facing. And I want you to look at verse 4. Because a minute ago we were talking about how we can feel beat down. We can feel worn out. And what's the use? Why even try? Well, here's some encouragement. Verse 4. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but they have divine power to destroy. I like the wording of some of the newer versions. Christian Standard Bible, New American Standard Bible. Demolish is the word. They demolish strongholds. There's a certain imagery with that word, right? When you think of demolish. You know, just pulverize is the word I think of. And notice the word stronghold. In some of your versions it will say fortresses, right? And I want you to see the imagery of a military fortress. Maybe you see a prison. And that word could apply there as well. Anything that's strengthened to keep people in or out. In fact, in the Hebrew, when this word was translated out into the Septuagint, the word goes back to the Hebrew word for tomb, or vault, or burial chamber, which is kind of interesting. And so what are these strongholds? What are these fortresses that he's talking about here? And the answer is any philosophy or religion or complex of ideas that stand up against God. An ideology. One writer has said, making the application today, we can view these things as people in the world being ensconced inside their various identity groups. They're fortified, they're resistance. They may not realize it, but their ideas have become as a prison, and eventually it will lead to their tomb. Wish I had said that. That was great. But look at verse 5. We're called to demolish or destroy these arguments. We're called to destroy or answer these ideologies. Anything, Paul says, that is raised up against the knowledge of God. We've got to stand up against any idea, any theory, any viewpoint that attacks divine truth. We're told here to go on the offensive, to make war against the lies that people have imprisoned themselves with. Did you hear me? We are to go on the offensive, brothers and sisters. Not cower back and fall back into a defensive position, holding on, hoping for the best, but to go out and use the weapon we've been given to hold up God's truth. What's the goal? To take every thought captive to obey Christ. And what's our weapon? It is truth. It is a system of right and wrong given to us by God. And this is why we've got to grasp that truth clearly. This is why we've got to be able to use it with power and effectiveness. We've got to be able to articulate that truth reasonably. And the promise is that when we do that, the arguments, the strongholds, the fortresses will be demolished. I want you to see the certainty. I want you to see the assurance. I want you to see the promise. I think sometimes we just give up before we even try and say, what's the use? You know, we use truth to defeat those who would stand against us. Because if we don't, the ideology that people are subscribing to is going to wind up being their tomb. We've got to show them the way out. We don't apologize for God's truth. We're not ashamed of it. We don't ignore it. We live by it. And we show others by our heart and our actions how to live. And yes, some are going to be offended. And yes, some are going to turn away. But our true love for other people must follow through and win the day. So the question is, how well do I know the truth? And how bold am I to proclaim it? So, I want to take you, before we wrap up, to the book of Jude. And I want you to look at verse 3. This fits in well because we move into the second quarter. There's going to be a young adult class on the book of Jude. This is kind of a pretext for that here in the next moment or two as I share this with you. And I want you to look at the first part of verse 3. Jude says, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, what he's saying is, I would really rather write to you about something positive. I would really rather communicate with something to you that's uplifting and encouraging and just something that we can all agree on and feel warm fuzzy about and so on and so forth. But then he says, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was delivered once for all to the saints. Listen, I know, and I thought long about this. I really struggled earlier in the week. It's the Sunday before Christmas. I'm going to have all these guests in the audience, and this is not one of those warm, fuzzy lessons that people are expecting, and blah, 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 blah. And should I really preach this, or wait, or whatever, That's a lot to go through your mind. But this is important. This is vital. I wish we could ignore all this and pretend everything's well. I wish we could stick our head in the sand and just go on with life. But what is the second part of Jude 3 calling us to, brothers and sisters? It is calling upon us to stand up. The directive here is to contend for the faith, to fight. To fight for what? The faith. Notice how Jude uses that there. He's talking about not something that's subjective. He's talking about the faith, something that's objective. It's been written down. It's been given to us once and for all. It's divine truth. It's objective. It's unchanging. It's relevant for every generation. Right is always right. Wrong is always wrong. We stand for that. We contend for it. We fight for it. That's why this is important. That's why we're talking about it. We may have lost some of that if we think about how we've interacted with the culture over the last few years. It's time for us to get back to it. So the question before us this morning as we close is, how will you resist the relativist culture? Will you resist the efforts of the world to wear you down? Will you get used to the idea of being hated? Just because you're hated doesn't mean you've done anything to them. They just don't like who you are, what you stand for. And that's okay. We're not in this to win a popularity contest with the world. Will you use your weapon? Will you go on offense and take the battle to Satan? Why is this so important? Because Jesus said in John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth will what? Set you free. Don't listen to the lies of the world that say you people are a bunch of narrow-minded people that just don't, you're just subscribing to all these backwoods ways and you're uneducated and you're just out of the mainstream or whatever. Don't listen to that. The precepts, the instructions of the Lord are right. Will we believe it? Will we accept it? Will we hold that banner high into our world? That's the question. Don't bow down. Don't give up. Keep doing what you're doing and trusting in the Lord. If you're with us this morning, you're outside of Christ, the lesson is for you. We want you to know that the truth is in Jesus, and it's only in Jesus. I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. Will you come to Him? He'll save you. He'll give you hope. He'll fill your life with peace, and He'll get you home. We can help you get started on that road today. This invitation is for you. If you're already a Christian, maybe you've just been beat down by the world, you've given in, you've compromised, and you know you've got to get back on track. No time like the present to do it than right now. Whatever we can do to help you, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.